All right, so I'm back for the second video. We're going to be talking about deontology and then virtue ethics, and then we'll have our quiz questions. All right, so the main idea behind, or summing up all of deontology, recall, the main intuitions here are justice and fairness and rights. So the way that deontology gets to those ideas is it has this for moral principle. An action is permissible, so it's okay to perform, only if it is universalizable and it treats all dignified beings with respect. So there's a lot of big words in there and terms that need to be defined. So universalizable we'll have to define, and we'll also have to define what qualifies as a dignified being and what qualifies as respect. So we need to define our terms here. So to the universalizability issue is getting at something like the idea of a golden rule. So the golden rule, recall, says that you should treat others as you would like them to treat you. But there's a problem with the golden rule, and that is if you like to be treated in weird ways, then the golden rule would license you to treat others in weird ways. So the problem with the golden rule is that it's based on desires, the desires of the acting agent. Immanuel Kant, the sort of godfather of deontology, thought that we need to strip desire from morality. Morality is not about desires, it's about reason for Kant. And the way he tried to fix the golden rule was he phrased the universalizability issue like this. So universalizability, again, is getting at fairness, right? So in a world in which everyone was acting on my maxim, would I be able to accomplish the goal of my action? So there's some stuff we need to unpack in there. Well, first, what is a maxim? So a maxim is sort of like a rule for action. It's what you're doing and what you're trying to accomplish by doing it. So we're rational creatures, so we act based on reasons. And when we're doing something, when we're performing an action, we're acting based on maxims, rules for action, right? So to figure out if an action is okay, we need to ask not a question about what would happen in this world if we perform the action. Utilitarians would have us ask that. And recall, utilitarianism was all about consequences. This is about the rule for action, what's causing you, what's motivating your action, right? So, in a world in which everybody is doing what you're doing, would you be able to accomplish the goal of your action? Take a everyday sort of an example here. So you're driving to work, you're a little bit late, there's a carpool lane, you reason, well, if I jump over the carpool lane, I can get to work faster. Let's say you have impressive reasons for believing that you won't be caught, that you'll just jump over the carpool lane, nobody will be super pissed off, you'll get to work earlier, everybody will be happy. So you reason that it's permissible to do it. So your reasoning goes like this. So you're caught in a traffic jam. Your reasoning goes like this. If I hop over to the carpool lane, I'm going to hop over to the carpool lane so that I can drive faster, get to work faster. And then you have to ask yourself the universalizability question. In a world, that movie trailer question, right? In a world in which everyone was jumping over the carpool lane to get to work faster, would I be able to accomplish the goal of my action, get to work faster by jumping over the carpool lane? And the answer is no, you wouldn't. Why not? Because everybody would already be over there, right? So this jumping over the carpool lane to get there faster doesn't pass the universalizability test. So that action is impermissible, even if it would lead to the best consequences. So utilitarianism might recommend that action under certain conditions, but deontology would say it's not universalizable, therefore it's not permissible. We'll get more into that in an example in a little bit, but now let's get to the second part of this. So that was the universalizability issue. Then there's the treating dignified beings with respect. So first, in what does our dignity lie? So humans are the stereotypical dignified beings, the ones deserving of respect for Kantian deontologists. And in what does our dignity lie? Kant reasoned that it's in our autonomy and rationality. So how does he define autonomy and rationality? Well, rationality is the ability to do a couple things. It's the ability to figure out complex ways of getting the things that we want. And then secondly, it's the ability to determine if the ways we're trying to get what we want are morally acceptable or not. And that, it turns out, for Kant, involves high-level cognitive capacities. Cognitive capacities that would be necessary for asking yourself this universalizability question, for figuring out if your actions are fair, if they're just, and that's going to be a pretty high bar to get over. So what's autonomy then? Autonomy is the ability that at least some human beings have, and that's the ability to be motivated by moral considerations. So human beings, and not non-human animals, and no, not all human beings, just some human beings, most adult human beings have this ability, where we can be motivated to do the right thing just because it's the right thing to do, even if we don't want to do it, even if other people don't want us to do it, but just because just because it's the morally correct thing to do. So here you can think of examples like we should benefit others whenever we can, without breaking these moral principles outlined here. Imagine you're in a war and you're there with another soldier. You don't like them. Somebody throws a grenade in to your foxhole, and one of you has to jump on the grenade to save the other. Otherwise, you both die. So you think, this person who I'm with, they're kind of an asshole. I don't really like them. I don't want to do this, but it's the morally right thing to do, so I'm going to do it because it's the morally right thing to do, and you jump on the grenade, right? So we're able to be motivated to do things that we don't want to do just because they're the right thing to do. And that's what Kant means, that's what deontologists like Kant mean when they talk about our autonomy, our ability to be motivated by the moral law within us. So now that we know what beings are dignified, what does it mean to treat them with respect? Well, treating with the respect can mean a lot of things, but at minimum what it means is not treating somebody as a mere means, so as a mere tool to accomplish what you're trying to accomplish. Now, note, deontologists like Kant are not saying you can never treat somebody as a means to your ends, as a means towards your goals. It is permissible as long as you're not treating them only as a means. So it's okay, say, to take a taxi, right? So when you take a taxi, you're using somebody as a means to get from one place to another, but you're not treating them only as if they were a tool for you. You would be if you ran out on the fare. But if you pay the fare, then you're respecting the fact that you're respecting them, and you're respecting what they're trying to do with their lives, what they're trying to accomplish. And you both agree that to use each other as means under certain conditions. Under the condition, you'll take the taxi and you'll pay the person under the condition that he gets you to where you're trying to go, he or she gets you to where you're trying to go, and they'll take you to where you're trying to go under the condition that you pay them. So you're treating each other as means, but not as a mere means. Now, if you do run out on the fare, then you're not treating the taxi driver as an end in themselves, as a rational, autonomous being capable of determining their own goals that they're going after and how they want to achieve them. You're instead treating them as if they were a mere tool for you getting what you want. And then that's problematic. If you were to push somebody in front of a speeding trolley in an attempt to stop the trolley from hitting other people, that would be treating them as a mere means, as if their value was reducible to that of a trolley brake. But human beings are not things, they're not trolley brakes, so they shouldn't be treated as such. And if we do that, we're treating them immorally. All right, so let's run these principles, these two principles, through an example. Lying to get a loan. So imagine you're in a circumstance where you're down on your luck and you need a loan, say to pay rent or something, and you know you'll never be able to pay it back for whatever reason, like you have a degenerative condition and things are not getting better and you're not going to be able to pay this loan back, but you realize that the person will, say you're getting it from a person and not a bank, because we want to leave banks and the morality of banks out of this. Let's talk about a person. So you're trying to get a loan from somebody to pay your rent. And you realize that they'll only give it to you if you lie to them, saying that you'll be able to pay it back. So if you were to lie, you'd be following the rule, I will lie in the event that I need money and can't pay it back in order to get a loan. So then you ask yourself, is this morally permissible according to deontology? So you have to ask the question, in a world in which everybody lies to get bank loans, would I be able to get a bank loan by lying? And the answer is no. Why? It's because in a world in which everybody lied about being able to pay back, I kept saying bank loans. In a world in which everybody lied about being able to pay back loans, nobody would be giving out loans. Why? Because nobody would trust anybody else. That benefiting from a lie depends on other people telling the truth, so that people take your word for things, so that you can achieve the goal of your action. In a world in which everybody was lying in this circumstance, nobody would take people's word in this circumstance, so you wouldn't be able to get the loan based on your word. So you'd be treating yourself as an exception to the rule, which is unfair. So this rule cannot be adopted universally. It would be self-defeating. People would stop believing one another, and then the practice of lying could no longer persist. So it's not that lying in that world would lead to bad consequences. It's that you couldn't accomplish the goal of your action in that world where everybody was lying to get a bank loan. Then let's look at the humanity test. Does it pass the humanity test, or would you be objectionably using a rational, autonomous being as a mere means to acquire money? And it's obvious that you are. You're not respecting the fact that they have their own plans for that money that don't involve giving it to you, and that's why you're lying to them. You're undermining their humanity, according to this analysis. So, seems fairly intuitive, leads to some interesting consequences. So Some deontologists like Kant are here to say you should never tell a lie under any circumstances whatsoever, because you would always be treating yourself as if you were an exception to the rule. So it'd always be unfair, and you'd always be undermining somebody else's humanity by treating them as a mere means to whatever you're trying to accomplish by telling them a lie and not giving them all of the information, not giving them the information. So that is a pretty far out consequence, which brings us to some other potential problems. So that universalizability test, while it seems promising, it's an upgrade on the golden rule. It's not sufficient for an action being permissible. So in other words, just because an action is universalizable, that doesn't mean that the action is permissible. So imagine somebody's goal is to keep their lawn as nice as possible, and there is a postman who constantly steps on the person's lawn on the way to deliver the mail, and the person thinks, I want to kill this postman. They're fanatical about their lawn care. And so they ask themselves the universalizability question: in a world in which everybody was shooting people that step on their lawn in order to keep their lawn nice, would I be able to keep my lawn nice by shooting this person? And the answer is, well, yeah. In fact, keeping their lawn nice would be even easier in that world, because people would be killing all the habitual lawn steppers. So that passes the universalizability test, but it's clearly not permissible action. Secondly, that humanity test is a little bit vague. Exactly what the requirements are for treating a being with respect respect is a sort of a vague concept. Doesn't mean you just have to stay out of their way. Doesn't mean you have to foster their autonomy and like set up conditions such that autonomy and rationality can be furthered in the world. It's unclear. Finally, many sentient beings are left out of the moral community, unlike with utilitarianism, where non-human animals are part of the moral community and deserve moral consideration, in fact, equal moral consideration. For deontologists who relying on the principle of humanity, not only are non-human animals out because they're not rational, they're not autonomous in the specific meaning that Kant has for those terms, many human beings would not count as rational and autonomous, would not be able to figure out if actions are morally acceptable. I mean, think about kids here, or severely mentally disabled. And they're not autonomous. They might not be autonomous, and they might not be able to be motivated to do something just because it's the right thing to do. Certainly kids have, it's impossible for them up until a later age. All right, so then the chapter gets into some more specific concerns for business ethics. So 2 views of corporations, one of which grows out of this deontological theory. So first, there's the shareholder view of corporations. The shareholder view says the paramount function of a corporation is to maximize the returns of the shareholders, the owners of the corporation. And the executives, so like the CEO, etc., that's what they're hired to do. Their only function is to maximize profits for business owners. Now, that seems pretty, what do we say, like an egoistic, like corporations would be acting egoistically only in the benefit of the owners. An opposed view is the stakeholder view of corporations. So on that view, corporations are responsible members of a community with all associated duties and privileges, and they're more like a partner instead of a scavenger. So instead of ruthlessly going after what's best for the shareholders, small part of the corporation, they are aimed at the well-being of all stakeholders. Now, what do we mean by stakeholders? We need to get into that more. So actions are analyzed in terms of their effects on any party which may be affected by the corporation's actions. So that includes shareholders, but it's not limited to shareholders. It also includes customers, suppliers, employees, and the community or communities in which the corporation might operate. So on the stakeholder view, management must treat stakeholders with respect, weighing their interests equally and not violating their rights. Now, let's contrast this with the shareholder view. On the shareholder view, if a corporation's function is to maximize the profits of the shareholders, then there could be situations that arise where violating workers' rights might be the way to do that. Even if certain rights are legally protected, others might not be. So the corporation might violate those rights that are not legally protected in order to maximize the profits of the shareholders. So why is this in the section on deontology? Because the justification for the stakeholder view is not self-interest. Now, somebody could justify it according to self-interest of the shareholders. Like a corporation might take the interests of all these stakeholders, weigh them in what action they were going to perform, because it might be the thing that's best for their bottom line. It might be the thing that allows their business model to be sustainable. But that's not necessarily the case. So it could be the case that ruthlessly profiteering would be most beneficial in short and long term for a corporation. So instead, the way the stakeholder view is justified is by the universalizability test. So imagine a case where a large corporation had a contract with their supplier where their supplier would provide them certain goods for a certain price. And they did that under certain conditions, meaning the conditions of power were such that they agreed to that contract. But then imagine the power relationship changes such that the large corporation gains more leverage against their supplier. And imagine that large corporation, even though they signed the contract, now that they have more leverage, they say, we're not going to stay up with that contract. Instead, we're going to try to negotiate for a new contract and get those goods for a cheaper price. Now, according to the shareholder view, it might be perfectly legal to not honor that contract, and if it's in the shareholder's best interest, which it probably would be, financially speaking, then that's what the corporation should do. However, note that that action doesn't pass the universalizability test. Why? The corporation there would be trying to break a contract in order to get a new contract. So then they have to ask themselves, in a world in which all businesses are breaking contracts in order to get new contracts whenever power relationships change, would they be able to accomplish their goal of getting a new contract whenever power relationships shifted? And the answer is no, they wouldn't be. And why not? Because nobody would respect the terms of a contract. The whole idea of a contract would be null and void. Everybody would just be doing whatever they could to extend their power in the moment. There would be no settled agreements because nobody would trust other corporations to make contracts and honor their contracts. So that's where the stakeholder view comes from, and it's a much more attractive view of what a corporation should be doing, and that's looking out for everybody that has a stake in that corporation's continued existence. All right, so deontology, rival theory to utilitarianism. Now let's look at another moral theory. That theory is virtue ethics. Now, virtue ethics is a little bit of an oddball out of this group of three, whereas the two prior ethical theories started with the question of what makes a morally correct action morally correct. Virtue ethicists start with the question, what traits of character make someone a good person? So it starts with a question about moral agents and what makes an agent morally good or morally bad, instead of what makes an action morally good or morally bad. And the answer, again, to go back to our summary, was actions are correct when people are good when they're virtuous. So then secondarily, what makes an action correct? An action will be correct then when it's a virtuous action. So we need to define some terms here. So what's a virtue? A virtue is a commendable trait of character manifested in habitual action. So something done repeatedly, and something that flows from a good character trait. Good character traits like courage, temperance, generosity, honesty, loyalty, all the things that we would say of like a virtuous person, all the qualities that they might have, right? Now, according to Aristotle, virtues are a mean between two vices. So, no, that S belongs there. So each virtue is a mean between vices. One of excess, one of deficiency. So you can go overboard in having a certain character trait, you can not have enough of it, and somewhere in between is the virtue. Now, in order to have a virtue, it's not enough just to do right actions. It's necessary that you do the actions consistently and that you feel a certain way while doing them, that you feel good about doing them. Next, moral training is a matter of developing good habits, so through practical wisdom and practice. So becoming virtuous for virtue theorists like Aristotle is a matter of practice. It's a skill. So if you want to learn how to play the piano, you do it. You play the piano, right? If you want to learn how to be a morally good person, you do it. You practice it. So how do we do that? What is this thing, practical wisdom? Well, we have to look at a lot of different variables to determine how we can be better people and how we can be more virtuous and perform more virtuous deeds. So the way we do that, we have to look at things like, and this gets into our next point, all actions on a virtue theoretic framework are parts of continuing histories. So I have to look at myself if I want to make myself more virtuous and think, in which ways am I already virtuous? In other words, things that I don't have to work on. In what ways am I deficient that I have to get more of a virtue? In what ways am I overshooting it to have too much? Am I just extra and need to rein it back a little bit? And then I have to look at my options in a certain situation, weigh the different options, ask myself, like, which of these actions would be the courageous action, the generous action, whatever virtues might apply there. I have to think about cultural norms and how my action fits into that system of cultural norms. And I have to look at all that using my practical wisdom, and then I have to practice doing these actions over and over and over again, because it's not enough just to do one courageous thing and then say you're courageous. You have to do multiple courageous things to be courageous, and especially in times where it's difficult to do the courageous thing, right? All right, so let's look at some of these virtues a little bit more closely. So some of those that are especially relevant to business ethics would be generosity, honesty, and loyalty. So generosity is a virtue. It's the mean, so somewhere between stinginess, the deficiency, the vice of deficiency, and then extravagance, the vice of excess. So imagine you have plenty of resources. Somebody's really down on their luck. They need a meal, and they let you know that they're starving and could use some food. There are many ways you could act according, in response to that. You could, on the one hand, give them nothing, but swift kick to the face or something, or just turn and walk away. Be the stingy response. On the other hand, you could give them the keys to your car and your house. That might be an extravagant response. Somewhere in between is the virtue of generosity. Now, note this is slightly different, or really ends up being perhaps really different than the utilitarian recommendation, where we always need to be maximizing well-being, which usually involves, for people in privileged situations like ourselves, that we have more, speaking in terms of worldwide population, right? That we have more than other people do, and we're always required to give to the point of marginal utility. This also is very different than one moral teacher, Jesus's ideas about generosity, that we should dedicate our entire lives to trying to help the poor and the sick, and that a rich person, it's easier for a camel to fit through the eye of a needle than a rich person get into heaven, etc., etc. A virtue theorist might say, Jesus, that's a little bit extravagant. Generosity doesn't require all that much. It requires giving, but not as much as you're suggesting. Another virtue would be the virtue of honesty. So recall, deontologists like Immanuel Kant, who we were just talking about, had a prohibition against lying. It's never okay to lie. But one thing virtue theorists are quick to point out is never lying is neither necessary nor sufficient for having the virtue of honesty. So let's start with sufficient first. Why is it not sufficient? Isn't somebody who never tells a lie, aren't they an honest person? Well, not necessarily. Why is lying wrong? It's wrong because you're manipulating somebody. You're undermining what they're thinking, what they're trying to do, right? But there are ways to do that without directly telling a lie. So imagine somebody comes up to me, they're upset with me and they want to, argue with me about something, and they say, but they don't know what I look like, and they say, hey, where's Brian? And I say, oh, Brian's nearby. And they walk off looking for me. Now, what I said is the actual truth. I was nearby. In fact, I was right next to them, right? But through that truth, I was attempting to mislead them. And so if somebody said, is that acting honestly? Well, not really, right? So even if you never tell a lie, that's not enough for being an honest person. Being honest also entails not manipulating people. Now, telling a lie might not be necessary for honesty either. In some cases, telling a lie might be totally morally permissible, and we'd say somebody's honest even though they occasionally say a white lie, right? So your friend asks you, hey, how does my haircut look? And it's awful. And you say, oh, it's not bad. It's pretty good. Yeah, you look good. That's telling a lie. Are we going to say somebody's not honest just because they tell an occasional white lie? It seems not. So the virtue of honesty lies somewhere between some extremes here. So on one hand, being dishonest. On the other hand, being blunt or honest to a fault. You hear people say that. Another virtue is loyalty. Now, when it came to utilitarianism and deontology, they both have the view that that from the moral point of view, a person is a person is a person, and it doesn't matter how they're related to you. It doesn't matter whether you like them or not, the way our obligations to them are exactly the same as anybody else. Virtue ethicists say that's crazy. Loyalty is a virtue, and we should have more obligations. We should treat people better who are, say, our family members or our friends. Those who have been good to us deserve some good treatment in return. And we shouldn't treat people strictly impartially, like utilitarianism or deontologists would recommend. But you, of course, can go too far. You can have fanatical devotion to somebody where you wouldn't do anything that might have a negative effect on them, no matter what they might do. That's taking loyalty overboard. And not having enough loyalty would be something like strict impartiality, or maybe even worse, being traitorous or something like that. So how do these fit into our evaluation of corporations? Well, they probably should be generous in in many contexts. Hopefully they deal honestly with their suppliers, with their customers, with their employees. And should they be loyal? It seems like they should show some loyalty to those stakeholders. So what problems does virtue theory face? Well, some potential problems. It's culturally relative, so there isn't a strict rule for when an action is correct and when it's not correct. That's eternal and everlasting and applies to all cases. Those type of rules utilitarians and deontologists recommend. But virtue theorists don't give us that sort of rule. In fact, determining what's right or wrong depends to a significant extent on what culture people live in. There's no external criterion, which leads to what we might call the good Nazi problem, where somebody might live in a society, imagine somebody lives in Nazi Germany and they're being courageous and they're being generous and honest and all this stuff, but it's all in service of the goals of a horrible regime. They might be virtuous in that context, but clearly their behavior is not okay. The second big problem is it's incomplete. So it doesn't give us that action guidance. Now, these problems, what are formulated as problems, could actually be benefits. Like somebody could say, well, of course we don't give you a rule for action that determines in all cases whether that action is permissible or impermissible. That would be crazy to do, right? It'd be crazy to try to come up with a rule that did that. So these could actually be formulated as virtues. So the last thing we're going to cover here is what would it be like for a virtuous corporation? So we speak of corporate virtue and vice all the time. So we could talk about Enron being greedy for hiding their losses in an attempt to inflate their stocks, right? Greedy and dishonest, etc. So vicious, right? And the fact that corporations talk about their culture encourages this way of thinking. So think about dress codes, right? This is a Citibank way of dressing, or all kinds of businesses have certain policies in place that try to build a culture for their company. So because of this, corporations can be held accountable even when no individual in the corporation is. So let's look at the NASA example on page 47. The effect of the corporate culture is that it may lead to behaviors where no individual may be held accountable. In the case of the Space Shuttle Columbia, for instance, an engineer had suspected that there was significant damage to the wing and tried to get satellite pictures taken to determine if he was right. However, the bureaucratic nature of NASA held up his request because the engineer did not use the correct channels to report his concern. As it turns out, he was correct, and the investigatory board faulted the authoritarian and rigid culture at NASA. Yet at the same time, no individual was held accountable, because who would be held accountable there? We'll get into corporate responsibility later, but it makes sense to talk about the corporation being the responsible party here, because is that guy the responsible one when he was trying to report this problem but running into big bureaucracy? Not clear that that's the case. So interestingly, corporations can take on moral agency and can be evaluated according to virtue ethics. Are they exhibiting vices? Are they exhibiting virtues in their activity and their organization? All right, so those are the three big ethical theories that we'll be talking about throughout the rest of this course. Now let's get to the quiz question. So quiz question number 1. Why should we take a philosophical approach to morality instead of other approaches? For example, a common sense approach or a legalistic approach. A, the other approaches lead to inconsistencies. B, the justifications given by the other approaches leave a fundamental open question. C, the other approaches have misled us in the past. Or D, all of the above. Write down the quiz question number and your answer so that when you open the Canvas quiz, you'll have the answer down. Quiz question number 2. Which of the following approaches demands that corporations balance the interests of shareholders, customers, suppliers, employees, and the community? Is that A, shareholder theory, or B, stakeholder theory? I covered quiz question 1 in the other video lecture for this week, and quiz question 2 I talked about this week. So you can go back and look at what I said about those before you enter your answers. Thanks for sticking with me. I know that's a lot of lecture for 1 week.